Number 1. I'm not sure exactly what this guy's deal was, because I was young and in a foreign country, but I'm telling this story here based on the fact that everyone was afraid enough that they all hid indoors when they heard that he was out prowling around. I was like 7 or 8 years old, in Tonga, visiting my dad's friend and his family. They had a trampoline outside their house which I absolutely loved, but didn't get as much time to play on it as I would have liked, because I had to share with 5 other kids. One afternoon, when everyone was distracted and watching TV, I snuck outside to have some one-on-one time with the trampoline. I remember thinking it was really weird that there was nobody outside. And I mean nobody. It was like zombie apocalypse quiet. I was on the trampoline for about 5 minutes when a strange man walked up to me. He seemed off, but I couldn't put my finger on what was wrong with him. In hindsight, I think drugs were the most likely answer. He started talking to me, asking what I was doing, etc. He asked my name, and I gave him a fake name. Then he climbed up onto the trampoline with me and started getting uncomfortably close. He knocked me down and got on top of me. He had a horrible look in his eye, and I was absolutely terrified. I pushed him off with minimal effort. He just let me push him back up, to be honest. He was about 3 times my size and could have easily held me down. He got back up again. I didn't know what to do. For some reason, something deep inside me told me not to run, because I was afraid he would catch me quickly, and I knew I wasn't strong or fast enough to get away. I thought, I need to keep calm and trick him into thinking that I'm not afraid, then escape when I get a better chance. So I continued to calmly talk to him, answer his questions with random lies as I started gathering my things and getting ready to go back inside. He pushed me down one last time and let me get back up again, and I said something about my dad will be out looking for me soon. He said, "Oh, you're leaving? Yeah, sorry, I have to go, but it's been lovely, but my dad wants me back inside." And he just sat down on the trampoline. Just sat there. I went back inside and nobody had noticed I was gone. Not a soul. About an hour or so later, there was a bunch of commotion as the police had found a wanted suspect outside the house, passed out on the trampoline. The kids told me in hushed whispers that the man was a vampire, and if he bites you, you die. Which kind of freaked me out because he did try to bite me. I never told anyone I had been outside because I was afraid of getting in trouble. I still haven't told anyone outside of Reddit. Now, I obviously don't believe in the vampire aspect of the story, but it was still pretty fucking weird. And I think he probably did kill some people. Number 2. My dad and his brother were both picked up on separate occasions by John Wayne Gacy. They grew up in the same area as him, around the time that he was out and about. My dad was a teenager in the late 70s. This is the story, as my dad tells it. One day, he was trying to get a ride home and resorted to hitchhiking, which he did pretty regularly in those days. He got picked up by a guy in a station wagon and immediately knew the vibes were off. He said there was an assortment of weird knickknacks on the dashboard, which was just the first warning sign. Then the driver started asking really strange questions about sex and just generally weird questions. The guy asked him his name, and my dad didn't want to give his name, so he gave his brother's name. About 10 minutes into the car ride, my dad knew he needed out, so when they were at a stoplight, he booked it. Separately, my uncle, Dad's brother, had the exact same experience, down to the T. My uncle had the same thought not to give him his name, so he told him my dad's name. Neither my dad or my uncle told anyone about these encounters until years later. They went like 10 years without telling each other about it. A few years after this happened to both of them is when the news broke about John Wayne Gacy, and they both immediately knew it was the driver of the car they hitchhiked with. They could have very easily been 2 of his victims right there. Number 3. I grew up about a block and a half from Bob Berdella. He was eventually caught for picking up gay teenage men and torturing, raping, and killing them. Prior to that, he was, from what I remember, a pretty normal and fairly social person. He was actually a part of the neighborhood watch group that my dad was on. He ran an oddities shop at the flea market near our house called Bob's Bizarre Bazaar, which I guess is a little weird. I still remember the day when he was caught. I was over playing at a friend's house whose father was a police sergeant. There was a frantic knocking at the door, and like 30 seconds later, my friend's dad asked us to go play at my house for a while. One of Bob's would-be victims had escaped by shimmying out of a second-floor window while Bob was at work. The man, basically naked, ran across the street and started pounding on doors, and the first people that answered were next door to the house I was playing at. They immediately came next door, knowing a cop lived there, so Bob lived across from the police sergeant for years, torturing, raping, killing, and burying his victims in dog food bags in his backyard, never being caught. This all happened just as school was getting out for the summer, and my parents just let us stay home while they worked instead of doing daycare. Most days, we'd hang out in the backyard behind Bob's, which was slightly elevated above his, watching the cops dig up dead bodies. My mom claimed the number of the cops in the neighborhood for the next 2 months was so large that we were probably safer there than at a daycare. Number 4. I was a correctional officer for a few years, and I dealt with several serial killers. I can't give names. Frankly, they were just occupant of cell XXX to me anyway. I wasn't there to make friends. They seemed to have one thing in common. They were manipulative. They usually worked to try to get us to let our guard down and to integrate themselves with us. They struck me as kind of creepy, but that would have been more from me knowing what they were in for. I personally believe they were all clinically psychopathic as well, but I only know directly that one of them was certified as such. Their methods were different. One tried to pass himself off as a regular Joe, asking questions to ferret out info on the guards by talking about sports teams, asking the usual conversational questions, and then try to act concerned about our families if we had kids, etc. He sounded friendly, but it was obvious he was trying to build a knowledge base to use later. The other tried to pass himself off as a friendly, kind of goofy guy, and he was the worst offender in my book. He was a serial rapist and murderer of toddlers. The last one that comes to mind I found the most interesting and considered the most dangerous to be around. He was a chameleon of sorts. He had an instinctive ability to read people and adjust his attitude and interaction with them to fit that. I watched him change his demeanor, body language, and tone of voice almost instantly as he interacted with different people. It was like he was a totally different person each time. We were giving a briefing on him when he arrived for officer safety. He was a medically diagnosed psychopath with no conscience or empathy for others at all. He never gave us any trouble directly, but given the opportunity and incentive, would not hesitate to kill without a second thought. To him, it was no different than just squashing a bug. He entertained himself by manipulating other inmates into fighting amongst themselves, and he tried to do the same with the officers, but far less successfully. As to how it felt being around them, it wasn't really any different than being around any of the other murderers, rapists, and gang members, etc. I just used extra precautions when I was there, as warranted. Frankly, they were the easier inmates to manage, and generally gave us the least trouble. It was just part of the job, and interaction with them was no different than any other inmate either. Number 5. I'm not sure this counts, but I met a guy out on parole who burned a rival gang alive. We were both at the mechanics, waiting on safety inspections. I had my toddler with me. The guy's face was 3 layers deep of prison tattoos, a giant skull over his face with all sorts of embellishments and symbols extending over his forehead and down his neck. He saw my kid staring, or trying not to stare, and he commented on that. I apologized since kiddo was too young to know better. He started trying to explain what the tattoos meant, and that he hadn't just woken up one day and decided to turn his face into a skull. He said that he was the worst person I would ever meet, and then just asked if I remembered a rough description of the case. I recalled it from the news. It had been 10 or 12 years, but it was a nasty one. He told me what he'd done, and I listened. His face was barely recognizable under all the ink, and someone had broken his nose a couple of times since the mugshot was plastered all over. I tried to change the subject. He told me he was running errands for his brother and trying to get back on his feet. Then circled back to the night that changed his life. Mostly, I just listened some more. He'd been a stupid teenager who came up with a trap he didn't really expect to work, while angry that they'd killed his friend. It worked a lot better than he was expecting. He more than avenged his friend. I didn't know what to say, so I just listened and tried to channel my inner therapist to de-escalate. I had my kid with me, and this seemed potentially volatile. He repeated that he was the worst person I'd ever meet, and started getting real agitated, repeating that. He got really worked up and angry. I don't know what I was thinking, because I countered by asking if he'd ever raped a kid. He blinked and said empathetically no. I replied that A few murders and no child abuse put him several steps ahead of my aunt's ex-husband, so he wasn't even the worst person I'd eaten dinner with. Then I asked if he'd burn those people alive again if he had the chance to go back and choose. Again, empathetic denial. He said he'd probably shoot the one guy, but he wouldn't set the fire. It got out of control way too quickly. I responded that it sounded like he'd learned from the experience. I asked if he had any active warrants out, and he refused, and said he was following parole like a religion. I replied, "That's great. It sounds like you're really trying." I tried to think of what my therapist would say to calm things down. It kind of worked. By the time I left, he was on his phone with a parole officer, just weeping, no longer yelling at me that I needed to understand that he was evil and beyond understanding or anything like that. The cashier was furious with me for being nice to someone like that and for being related to my aunt's ex-husband. I did explain that we fully cooperated with and supported the police in regards to the aunt's ex-husband. My aunt chose the guy, not the rest of the family. For that matter, aunt's ex-husband might actually count. My cousin is sure his dad has killed people, and every few years we get contacted by the police looking for him. He's slimy and seems completely uncertain of the humanity of everyone who isn't a blood relative of his. Asshole kept asking me how I knew I could really think or feel and wasn't just a simulation of thought. I asked him the same thing. How did I know that he wasn't just an unpleasant rendering from my mind? He backed off a bit, but still kept trying to argue that other people weren't really people, that they didn't matter in contrast to his own wants and desires. They might be human, but they weren't people. Only his family were. Dude made my skin crawl.